The crimson sunset painted the Wyoming sky as Thomas Jackson crawled through the dirt, his shredded flesh leaving a trail of blood behind him. The grizzly's roar still echoed in his ears, even though the massive beast had finally abandoned him for dead among the pine trees of the Bighorn Mountains. It was 1878, and Thomas had spent the better part of a decade drifting across the frontier after the war between the states left him with nothing but nightmares and an aversion to settled life. At 32, he'd built a reputation as a reliable trail hand who kept to himself, spoke little, and worked hard. None of that mattered now as he dragged himself toward what he hoped was the direction of the nearest homestead, his consciousness fading with each painful inch forward. Darkness had nearly claimed him when he heard the creak of wagon wheels and a woman's startled gasp. "Good Lord in heaven," she exclaimed, her voice cutting through his fog of pain. "Hold on, mister, just hold on." That was the last thing Thomas remembered before waking to the sensation of fire across his chest and arms. He tried to rise, only to be gently pushed back by firm hands. "You'll tear those stitches if you move," said the same voice, now calm and measured. "That bear nearly took your arm off." Thomas forced his eyes open to find himself in a modest cabin. Sunlight filtered through homespun curtains, casting a warm glow across a woman's face as she bent over him. She was perhaps 25, with auburn hair tied back in a practical braid and intelligent green eyes that assessed him with clinical precision. "My name is Madeline Turner," she said, wringing out a cloth in a basin beside his makeshift bed. "You're at my homestead about 15 miles east of Sheridan. I found you half dead 3 days ago." 3 days, Thomas croaked, his throat parched. She nodded, helping him take a small sip of water. "You've been fighting fever. I wasn't sure you'd pull through." Her lips curved in a small, satisfied smile. "But I've gotten rather good at proving doubts wrong." Over the next days, Thomas learned that Madeline was a widow who ran her small ranch alone, save for occasional help from a neighboring family. Her husband had died 2 years prior from pneumonia, leaving her to manage everything herself. She'd learned medicine from her father, a doctor back east, knowledge that had saved Thomas's life. "Why not go back east?" Thomas asked one evening, a week after she'd found him. He was sitting up now, though his wounds still burned and his arm was bound tightly to his chest. "This is my land," she said simply, stirring a pot of stew that filled the cabin with savory aromas. "Robert and I built this place together. I'm not leaving it." Thomas nodded, understanding the stubborn pride that kept her rooted to this difficult life. He'd spent years running from his own past, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. Something about Madeline's quiet determination made him ashamed of his wandering. As May turned to June, Thomas's strength slowly returned. The deep gashes across his chest and back healed to angry red lines, and he began to use his injured arm in small ways. Each morning he pushed himself to do more around the homestead, feeding chickens, repairing fence posts, chopping kindling. Madeline protested at first, but soon accepted his help with tasks that had become overwhelming for one person. "You don't owe me anything, mister." "Jackson," she said one morning as he saddled her horse for her daily check of the small herd of cattle that grazed in the valley below. "Thomas," he corrected, "and I know I don't, but I'm not ready to ride out yet." He didn't add that he was beginning to wonder if he wanted to leave at all. Madeline studied him for a moment before nodding. "Thomas, then, and you're welcome to stay until you're healed." The days fell into a rhythm that Thomas found unexpectedly comforting. Each evening they shared meals at Madeline's small table, talking well into the night. He told her about growing up in Missouri, fighting for the Union despite his family's Southern sympathies, and the years of drifting afterward. She spoke of her childhood in Boston, her father's medical practice, and her decision to marry Robert Turner and follow him west to claim land under the Homestead Act. "I was terrified," she admitted one night. "I'd never even camped outdoors before we set out. Robert thought I'd demand to go home within a month. But you didn't." "No," her eyes grew distant with memory. "I discovered I was stronger than I knew. There's something about this land that demands everything from you but gives you back yourself." Thomas understood. The frontier had a way of stripping away pretense, leaving only what was true and essential. He'd never felt that more clearly than during these weeks of recovery, watching Madeline work from dawn until dusk, facing each challenge with quiet grace. By July, Thomas had graduated from helper to partner in the daily operations of the homestead. His wounds had healed enough that he could ride out with Madeline to check the cattle, mend fences, and even begin breaking ground for an expanded garden plot. They worked side by side under the vast Wyoming sky, their conversations comfortable, their silences even more so. "You know, I never asked what you were doing up in the mountains when that grizzly found you," Madeline said one afternoon as they took shelter from a sudden thunderstorm in a stand of cottonwoods. Thomas hesitated. "I was tracking a Mustang stallion, black as midnight with a white blaze. I've spotted him a few times over the years, thought maybe I'd try to catch him this time. Just to see if you could," he nodded. "Foolish, I suppose." "No," Madeline smiled. "I understand the pull of something wild and beautiful." Their eyes met, and for the first time, Thomas acknowledged the current that had been building between them. Madeline Turner was unlike any woman he'd ever known, strong but not hardened, independent but not closed off. Something in him longed to cross the invisible boundary they'd maintained, but he held back, uncertain of his welcome. The moment passed as the reins slackened and they returned to work, but something had shifted. That night, as they sat before the fire, Thomas found himself studying Madeline's profile, the way the firelight caught in her hair and illuminated the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, evidence of years, squinting in the harsh sun. "I should leave soon," he said suddenly, the words surprising even him, Madeline's hands stilled on the shirt she was mending. "You're welcome to stay, Thomas. The work goes faster with two, and winter will be here before we know it. I don't want charity. Is that what you think this is?" She asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I don't know what this is," he admitted. "I've been drifting so long, I'm not sure I remember how to stay in one place." She set aside her mending and faced him directly. "Then perhaps it's time to learn." The simple statement hung between them, laden with possibility. Thomas found himself standing, crossing to where Madeline sat and kneeling before her, his healed wounds pulled tight across his chest as he took her weathered hands in his. "I have nothing to offer you," he said. "No land, no money, no promises I know I can keep." "I'm not asking for any of those things," she replied, her green eyes steady on his. "Just your honesty, and perhaps your company through the winter to start." Thomas nodded, a weight lifting from him. "That I can give." Their first kiss was tentative, a question asked and answered in the glow of the fire. When they parted, Madeline's smile held a mixture of wonder and caution that reflected Thomas's own feelings. They had time, he realized. For once in his life, he wasn't in a hurry to move on. August brought the heat of high summer and a growing closeness between Thomas and Madeline. They worked together during the day and spent evenings planning improvements to the homestead. Thomas built a larger chicken coop and repaired the roof of the small barn, while Madeline preserved the garden's bounty for the winter ahead. "I've been thinking," Thomas said one evening as they sat on the porch watching heat lightning flicker in the distance. "That north pasture would support twice the cattle you're running now if we could get water to it." Madeline asked, her eyebrow raised. Thomas felt heat rise in his face. "If I were to stay, I mean." She reached for his hand, her calloused fingers intertwining with his. "I'd like that, Thomas, very much." That night, under a sky blazing with stars, Thomas Jackson made love to Madeline Turner for the first time. Their coming together was both tender and urgent, a promise exchanged without words as their bodies spoke what their hearts already knew. Afterward, lying in Madeline's narrow bed, Thomas traced the line of her shoulder and marveled at the turn his life had taken. 2 months ago, he'd been dying alone in the mountains. Now he held a future in his arms. "I never expected this," he whispered against her hair. "Nor I," she replied. "After Robert died, I thought that part of my life was over." "Are you sure about this, about me?" Madeline propped herself up on one elbow, her face serious in the moonlight. "I'm not a girl with romantic fantasies, Thomas. I know what I want and what I need. You're both." Her directness humbled him. "I'll try to be worthy of that." "Just be honest," she said, pressing a kiss to his scarred shoulder. "That's all I ask." As summer waned, Thomas and Madeline settled into a partnership that extended beyond the daily work of the homestead. They rode into Sheridan together, where Thomas formally introduced himself to the shopkeepers and ranchers who made up the small community. Some eyed him with suspicion, a drifter suddenly settled with the Turner widow, but others welcomed the obvious happiness he brought their neighbor. "Never seen Maddie smile so much," observed Mrs. Holloway at the general store as she packed their supplies. "Robert was a good man, but serious as a judge. You've brought some lightness back to her." Thomas glanced across the store where Madeline was selecting fabric, her face animated as she spoke with another woman. "She's brought me to life as well, madam." It was true. The man who had drifted aimlessly for years, nursing old wounds both physical and spiritual, was fading away. In his place stood someone with purpose, someone who looked forward rather than back. One clear September day, Thomas rode up into the mountains where the grizzly had attacked him. The aspen trees were turning gold, their leaves trembling in the breeze. He dismounted at the spot where he'd nearly died and stood quietly, taking in the beauty of the wilderness that had nearly claimed him. A movement caught his eye, a flash of black against the golden trees. The Mustang stallion appeared on a ridge above, its powerful body silhouetted against the sky. Man and horse regarded each other for a long moment before the stallion tossed its head and disappeared into the forest. Thomas smiled. Some things were meant to remain wild and free. He no longer felt the need to chase what couldn't be captured. When he returned to the homestead, Madeline was waiting on the porch, concern etched on her face. "You went back up there," she said. It wasn't a question. Thomas nodded, dismounting and leading his horse to the water trough. "I needed to see it again, to understand. And did you?" He turned to her, taking in the woman who had saved him in every way a person could be saved. "I did. That bear could have been the end of me, but instead it led me here. To you." Madeline stepped close, resting her hand on his chest where the scars still stood out pink against his tanned skin. "Sometimes the worst things lead us to the best things." "I want to marry you," Thomas said, the words coming naturally. "If you'll have me." Her smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "I will." They were married 2 weeks later in the small church in Sheridan, with half the county in attendance. Madeline wore a new blue dress, and Thomas a suit borrowed from a neighboring rancher. The celebration afterward spilled out onto the town's main street, with music and dancing continuing well into the night. As autumn deepened into winter, Thomas and Madeline prepared for the harsh months ahead. They added a room to the cabin, built up their woodpile, and laid in stores. The first snow came early, blanketing the land in white and sealing them in their cozy home. Those winter evenings became precious to Thomas. Sitting before the fire with Madeline, planning the spring planting or simply reading to each other from one of the books she'd brought from Boston, he found a contentment he'd never known possible. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked one night as wind howled around the cabin. "The city, I mean." "All those people and conveniences." Madeline considered the question. "Sometimes I miss the bookshops and museums, concerts," she smiled. "But I don't miss the noise or the crowds, and I've found that happiness has little to do with convenience." Thomas pulled her closer. "Even when that happiness includes a battered old cowboy who showed up half dead on your doorstep." "Especially then," she murmured against his lips. As winter gave way to spring, Madeline shared news that filled Thomas with both joy and terror. She was expecting a child. The baby would arrive in late autumn, just before the next winter. "Are you happy?" she asked as they stood in the newly plowed field, the soil rich and dark beneath their boots. Thomas placed his hand on the slight swell of her stomach. "More than I have words for," he said. "And terrified in equal measure." "Good," Madeline laughed. "That means you understand what we're undertaking." The months that followed were filled with hard work and preparation. Thomas expanded their cattle herd, buying stock from a rancher who was returning east. He built furniture for the baby's corner of their bedroom and traded labor with neighbors to ensure they'd have help during harvest when Madeline would be near her time. In October of 1879, just as the first frost silvered the grass, Victoria Jackson came into the world after a long labor that left Thomas pacing outside the cabin while the midwife and her assistant attended Madeline. The baby's lusty cries were the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. When he was finally allowed inside, Thomas found Madeline pale but triumphant, their daughter nestled against her breast. "Meet your daughter," Madeline said, her voice tired but happy. "Victoria, after my mother." Thomas took the tiny bundle with trembling hands. The baby blinked up at him with eyes the same deep green as her mother's. In that moment, looking down at this new life they'd created, Thomas felt the last pieces of his old restlessness fall away. Here was his purpose, his reason for all that had come before. "Hello, Victoria," he whispered. "Your mama and I have been waiting for you." The years that followed brought changes to the Turner Jackson homestead. Thomas's skill with horses became known throughout the county, and he began training stock for neighboring ranches. Madeline's garden expanded into a small orchard, and she supplemented their income by selling preserves and remedies made from her carefully tended herbs. Victoria grew into a spirited child with her father's dark hair and her mother's determined nature. By the time she was 5, she was riding her own pony and helping with chores, her laughter a constant soundtrack to their days. In 1885, the family welcomed a son, Michael, completing their family. Thomas, now firmly established as one of the area's respected ranchers, often marveled at how completely his life had transformed. The drifter who once counted his worth by the distance he could cover in a day now measured it in acres cultivated, children raised, and years spent loving one extraordinary woman. On the 10th anniversary of the Grizzly Attack, Thomas and Madeline rode up into the mountains together, leaving the children with trusted neighbors. They made camp near the spot where Thomas had nearly died, now a place of beauty rather than terror. Under a canopy of stars, Thomas held Madeline close. "Do you ever regret it?" he asked. "Taking in a half-dead stranger who appended your carefully ordered life," Madeline laughed, the sound echoing among the pines. "Not for a single moment. You didn't append my life, Thomas Jackson. You completed it. Even when I track mud into your clean kitchen, or disagree with you about how to break that new colt, especially then," she said, echoing words spoken long ago. "Love isn't about perfection, it's about finding someone whose flaws fit with yours." Thomas kissed her then, marveling that after all these years his heart still quickened at her touch. "I love you, Madeline Jackson, more today than yesterday and less than tomorrow." They made love beneath the Wyoming sky, their passion undiminished by time and familiarity. Afterward, as Madeline slept in his arms, Thomas watched the stars wheel overhead and thought about the strange, winding path that had brought him here. The grizzly that had nearly killed him had instead driven him toward life, toward love and family and purpose. Those terrible wounds, now faded to silver scars that mapped his chest and arms, had led to healing deeper than skin and bone. Thomas Jackson, once a man without roots or direction, had found his true north in the arms of a woman brave enough to build a life in the wilderness. Together, they had created something that would outlast them, both a legacy of love, hard work, and resilience. As dawn broke over the mountains, Thomas woke Madeline with a gentle kiss. "Time to head home," he said. "The children will be waiting." She smiled sleepily, reaching up to trace the lines of his face. "Home," she echoed, "the sweetest word I know." Hand in hand, they walked to their horses, ready to return to the life they'd built together, a life neither could have imagined before fate, and a grizzly bear intervened to place them on the same path. In the years that followed, the Jackson family prospered. Their ranch expanded, and their children grew strong and capable in the challenging embrace of frontier life. Victoria, with her father's affinity for horses, eventually took over the training business, while Michael showed his mother's gift for healing and studied medicine in Denver before returning to establish the area's first proper doctor's office. Thomas and Madeline aged together, their bodies weathered by sun and work, their bond deepened by shared joys and sorrows. They welcomed grandchildren, survived droughts and blizzards, and watched as Wyoming territory became a state and the frontier gradually transformed into settled country. In 1908, 30 years after a wounded cowboy crawled from the mountains into a widow's care, Thomas and Madeline sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching the sunset paint the sky the same crimson hue of that fateful day. "We've had a good life," Thomas said, his once dark hair now silver, his hand still firmly holding Madeline's. "The best," she agreed, leaning her head against his shoulder, "and there's still more to come." Thomas smiled, knowing she was right. Their story, begun in blood and pain, had blossomed into something beautiful and enduring. Like the land they'd tended, it had required hard work, patience, and faith, but had yielded rewards beyond measure. "I'm glad that bear didn't finish me off," he said with a chuckle. Madeline squeezed his hand. "So am I, my love, so am I." As darkness settled over the ranch they'd built together, Thomas Jackson gazed at the woman who had saved him in every way that mattered. In her eyes, he still saw the determined young widow who had tended his wounds and shown him a path to love, a path he continued to walk with gratitude and joy, one day at a time.